Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Living Manna Church. I am Pastor Dave Sain, Senior Shepherd at Living Manna Church. Thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. It is our Wednesday night Bible study. We are in the book of Thessalonians, been going through it for a couple of weeks now. We've been doing some introductory stuff, but we are going to actually get into, at some point anyway, the book of Thessalonians today, so I'm glad that you're here with me tonight. Let me just remind everybody, just usual housekeeping stuff. If you are not subscribed, if you enjoy the study, if you're fed by the study, if you're encouraged by it, please subscribe. Be part of our LMC family. We would love to have you. You'd be notified every time we go live. We do all sorts of different things, from Wednesday night Bible study to morning manna every day to weekend services to hidden manna. So there's a lot to keep you going in Yah throughout the week. So with all that, let's open up with a word of prayer, and then we'll just jump right into this. We got a lot of material to cover today. Father, give us eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart that's willing to obey. In Yeshua's name, amen and amen. Okay, so here we go. Study for tonight. Like I said, we are in Thessalonians, and I want to kind of jump right into it because we got a whole bunch of stuff to talk about. So we're in Thessalonians. We're going to start chapter 1 today. I don't know how far we're going to get along in chapter 1, but we're going to start chapter 1. And the subtitle for tonight is called Tribulation. Tribulation. Now, before we actually get any further into the study or get to that point where we're actually in Thessalonians, I want to make sure that we've got a couple of principles down, because we've been doing an introduction for a couple of weeks now, right? And we've been concentrating on Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13, and many other supportive verses. And that's all, those are all what we today commonly call end time verses. But we've been looking at it from a very, very different perspective, that really what those verses are actually about is the destruction of Jerusalem. And they include the second coming of the Master. But in all reality, when you read through each one of those chapters, actually there's multiple chapters about the destruction of Jerusalem, and then there's one verse about the second coming. Or in Matthew, maybe two verses about the second coming, and then it goes back to talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so what we've kind of done is we've made the emphasis the second coming of the Lord, the Master, but we've neglected really what the first part of the story is, or really what the main part of what Yeshua is actually talking about, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem, not as a future event, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple as a historical event, as an event that affected those people of that generation, of that day in 70 AD. That is what I believe the Master is talking about, and that is what makes the plain meaning of the text make so much more sense when you understand it. But there's a principle I want you to realize, because people would read and say, well, he talks about coming from east to west, and isn't that his coming? And then later on he talks about coming in the clouds of glory, the sign of the Son of Man. Are those the same event? Well, I want you to realize up on the screen there, and of course the notes are available. You can download them. You can go to the description box below this on YouTube. You can go to the app and you can download it so you can keep up with us. But I want you to understand a very, very important principle. I think we touched on this a couple of weeks ago, that when Yah does something, right, it was Yah who destroyed the first Jerusalem and brought them into captivity for 70 years. But it wasn't, Yah did it. The Master did it. He says he did it. He said he would do it. He did do it. And it was him doing it, but he did it through Nebuchadnezzar. And then, of course, later on, sending the exiles out of Babylon or out of Persia, he said that he would do it, that he would bring them, that he would come and bring them. And what he did is he used Cyrus and Nehemiah and others as well, Ezra. But it was Yah who did it. Yah did those things. And I want you to get used to that concept, because when it talks about the day of the Lord, now there's actually a couple different days of the Lord. There's a day of the Lord that is for the nations. And I really believe those are all historical events as well. But normally, the day of the Lord that the Master is speaking about here, and that is focused on in multiple books, is always about the destruction of Jerusalem. whether it's in Hosea, whether it's in Joel, whether it's all over the place, to be quite honest with you. But I want to go over a couple of verses so that you can see them. Here is, and let me make this just a little bit bigger for everybody. Here is Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 21. And I want you to listen to the language and be really, really sensitive to this. Here is the beginning of the book of Isaiah. This is all about, how bad Jerusalem is and what Yah is going to do to it. And these are all verses that Messiah quotes. Messiah quotes out of Isaiah multiple times, as do the gospel writers, the epistle writers as well. So here's chapter 1 and verse 21 talking about the upcoming destruction of Jerusalem. So Yeshua is saying that all these words Isaiah was speaking, he was speaking about his day. Not the first destruction of the temple, but about Yeshua's day. So the first destruction of the temple under Nebuchadnezzar sort of becomes the dry run. You hear Jeremiah lament over Jerusalem and cry over it because God, Yah is going to use the words of Jeremiah to remind us of what did happen, so that we understand when it happens again, we can read those words and know that this is what was going on. So here's Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 21. And it says, how the steadfast city has become a whore. Okay, right off the bat, we're talking about Jerusalem, right? That's Jerusalem. She is the whore. She is the harlot of Babylon. So how the steadfast city has become a whore. I have filled it with right ruling, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Guys, that's almost verbatim what Yeshua says to the woe to the Pharisees. At the end, he calls them murderers. You guys are murderers. Your forefathers are murderers. You guys are murderers just like them. You're a murderer just like your father. So this is coming right out of Isaiah. Verse 24 says, therefore, the Master declares, Yod He Vav He, of hosts, the mighty one of Israel. So there's no doubt about who we're talking about, right? We're talking about Elohim. We're talking about Yah, the mighty one of Israel. I shall be eased of my adversaries, and I shall be avenged of my enemies. So who's going to avenge his enemies? Well, the Master is. Yah is. That's what he's telling us. So who is the one who comes for judgment and wrath upon Jerusalem? Yah does. It is Yah's coming that does this. It is the day of the Lord, that coming, that does it. Now, that's not the same thing as the second coming. But that is a coming of the Lord, not in all of his glory, splitting the sky, but that is his coming for wrath, for vengeance. Here's Isaiah chapter 2, and we got, honestly, there's dozens and dozens of verses like this, but here's Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 12. For Yod He Vav He of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty. He's speaking about Jerusalem. Against all that is lifted up, so that it is brought low. Verse 19, and they shall go. So he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and what's going to happen when Jerusalem is destroyed. And they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth from dread of Yod He Vav He and the splendor of his excellency when he arises to shake the earth mightily. And by earth, it means the land of Israel. That land, that earth is what it's talking about. Israel, Eretz Israel. But I want you to notice it says, who does this? Who is going to come and destroy the city, the proud and lofty, that the people on the inside will say, let the rocks fall on us? Now, this is a quote Yeshua makes. I believe it's in the Gospel of Luke. And also what we read in Revelation amongst the seals, that they hide from the wrath of the Lamb. It's not the coming of the Lamb, it's the wrath of the Lamb. And what do they cry out? Let the rocks fall on us. Well, this is where it comes from. This is the verse that Revelation is quoting, and also that Yeshua quotes on the day of his crucifixion. So it is Yah coming, it is Elohim coming in judgment, but he does it using other vessels. But it's still him. It's still the wrath of the Lamb, no matter how you count it. Here's Isaiah chapter 26 and verses 4 and 5. And it says, trust in Yod He Vav He forever. For in Yah, Yod He Vav He, is a rock is a rock of ages. For he, that is Yod He Vav He, Elohim, he shall bring down those who dwell on high. Almost the same verse that we just saw in chapter 2. He lays the exalted city low. Who does it? He does. He does it in his coming, in his majesty. He lays the exalted city low, Jerusalem. He lays it low to the earth, and he brings it down to the dust. So I just want you to notice, and just to keep in the forefront of your mind, that there is the coming of the Lord for vengeance, but that's not the same thing as Yeshua coming for the second time to rule and reign. And we see this in so many other instances where Yah does something. He says he comes in his power and in his might, but it's another nation that he's using to do it. And so that same understanding needs to be applied when we look at the verses of Matthew 24, Luke 21, and of course Mark chapter 13, and whatever other verses there are. So just from what we've gone over so far, and again, go back and listen to some of the older studies. It's real important that you do, because we need to understand the mindset. It is impossible if we don't understand these things. The reason why I'm doing this type of an introduction is because when we get into Thessalonians, there are going to be things said that are in relationship to these verses. But if you do not understand the context of these verses, well, then it's anybody's game. Now anybody can put anything in there, and we can kind of guess at it and think this is what it means, or this is what it says, or just use what the normal religious perspective of it is. Or we can go back and we can properly interpret it, really look at it, find out what the plain meaning of the text is, its historical context. And then when we read Thessalonians, not just Thessalonians, the other Peter, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, you'll realize there are things they are talking about that we assume we know what they're talking about, or we assume one thing, and it's not exactly the one thing that we were assuming that they're talking about. And it makes a big difference. So in all that we've read so far, if you read the Gospels, right, and if I were to boil down for you, what are the two most important points that Yeshua makes throughout the Gospels? Obviously, he makes lots of all of it's important, right? All of it's Yah's word. It's him giving us instruction or giving us Yah's instruction and how to live in it. But if I were to boil it down to the two most important points, they are the following. Number one, and this seems like, just so easy. It's right on the surface, and everybody knows this, right? The Son, Yeshua, of Elohim, the Elohim of the Shema, will come. He will give his life as a ransom for the world, and he will rise again from the dead 3 days later. That's the gospel, right? I mean, anywhere hopefully you'll hear people saying that. That's the gospel story. That is the core. That is one of the most important points that you need to get out of the story when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or anything else. That the Son of God, that the Elohim of Mount Sinai became flesh, dwelt among us, died as a sacrifice, rose again on the third day to forgive us our sins, right? That's across the board. That's got to be the initial thing you tell anybody, right? That's got to be that's sort of the first step of understanding. But what's the second most talked about thing that the Master says? The most important thing that the Master says? Well, and here's just some verses to kind of just confirm number one. On the second point there on your notes there, it says, Yeshua says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I'll raise it up. So he's talking about the death and resurrection right from the beginning of his ministry in John. That's John chapter 2. Later on in the Gospels, he says, no sign shall be given except the sign of Jonah. And of course, he goes on to explain Jonah. Just like Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days. And just like Jonah rose from the dead, so will the Son of Man, so will Yeshua. So that's the number one thing, right? That's obvious. That's how can you read this and not get that? The second point is big, but most people skip it. Most of us have not seen it. We've read it a gazillion times. We just never saw it. Because we were always looking for something else. Well, here's the second most important part of the gospel. Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed, and the people will be scattered. The people of that generation. That is as important to the whole message as anything else the Master says. These are the two most vital points of history, biblical history there are. I'd say maybe there's three, right? There's Mount Sinai, there's getting out of Egypt and going to Mount Sinai. There is Messiah dying, being raised from the dead. And the third most important event in all of biblical history is the destruction of Jerusalem. But we don't think that way. No, nobody does. Nobody thinks that way, because in our modern age, we've just dismissed it. It's got nothing to do with us. It's about them. So we don't really have to know about it. And we think up some other sort of explanation for these verses that fit our way of thinking, not what actually happened in history. So number two, then, if the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple are this second biggest point, and Yeshua spends a lot of time talking about this, here are just a couple of verses. Yeshua says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, know that its destruction is near. Remember, we talked about chapter 19, or chapter 20, 21, 22, 23 of Matthew. That's 4 chapters. All of those chapters, including chapter 24, all of it about the destruction of Jerusalem. And in Matthew 24, there's only 2 verses about the second coming. So you've got chapter after chapter and parable after parable talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and 2 verses talking about its coming. And then it goes back to talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So as an emphasis, is the question, and it's a rhetorical question at this point, is he emphasizing his second coming, or is he emphasizing his coming as the wrath of the Lamb for the destruction of Jerusalem? And obviously, that is what he's emphasizing. And of course, he says, so when you see Jerusalem surrounded, know that its destruction is near. And of course, again, in Matthew 23, your house will be left to you desolate. These are the words of Yeshua. And we went over them. You guys can go back, listen to the other studies. I don't want to go back and do all of that review, but just to refresh your mind, I want you to keep this in the forefront of your mind, because it's going to make a big, big difference as we get into Thessalonians. And here's Daniel chapter 9. Again, one of the most important prophecies there is in the scripture about the coming Messiah. And look at what the 2 main points of this prophecy are about. Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26. And again, there's a lot more to this prophecy. I know you probably got all sorts of questions as to the numbers and with the next verse, but I'm just want to concentrate on this verse, because this verse emphasizes everything that we just read in Matthew 24. And Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26 says, and after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be, here's the number 1, cut off, which correlates to the number 1 point. Messiah will come, he will die, he will be raised from the dead. And the next verse in Daniel says he establishes a covenant. But there it is, number 1, he shall be cut off and have not. And what's the number 2 point in this prophecy and in the gospel stories? The number 2 point is that, and the people, Rome, of a coming prince, Apollyon, shall destroy the city, Jerusalem, and the set-apart place, the temple. And the end of it is with a flood, a scattering of Judah, of the Jews, of the house of Israel, and waste. Desolations are decreed on the land, on the people, and fighting, the sword will be against them, all the way to the end. There's Daniel chapter 9. And what are the 2 things it emphasizes? Well, the very 2 major points of the Gospels. Messiah has come to die and be resurrected, and Jerusalem will be destroyed. These are the 2 really most important points that we must understand as we get into listening or reading some of these other accounts. Now, so what's the message? If what we just said is true, and it is, I mean, it's the plain meaning of the text. If we were back in the 1st century and Messiah raised from the dead, right? He's ascended. It's after the day of Shavuot, and his disciples now have to go out. Well, what's the first thing that they're going to say to people? Well, first things first, he is the Messiah. He is a son of Elohim. He did die. He did raise. And that's exactly what Peter does on the day of Shavuot as he preaches that message. Actually, he also makes a reference, believe it or not, to the destruction of Jerusalem in the message and what he quotes from Joel chapter 2, because Joel chapter 2 is about the destruction of Jerusalem. So even in the initial message, not only does he tell them about the coming Messiah, but he also tells them about the day of the Lord that's coming, the destruction of Jerusalem. So so again, if you're going to minister, and don't forget, the people that they are ministering to in the first century are predominantly Jewish. All of them go to synagogues. And we'll look at some of the verses where it tells us that, where Peter goes to, where Paul goes to, probably not today, but maybe another time. But just as information, Paul in Acts chapter 10, I believe it is commissioned to go to the house of Israel and to the Gentiles. And he does. Where Peter, we find out later on, is commissioned to go to the house of Israel, to the Jew. So that's got to be the first thing that you share, right? When you go to a synagogue, that's got to be the first thing that you share. People get that. They realize wonderful things are done. They've heard about what went on in Jerusalem. They come. We're talking about Jews and proselytes. We'll see that in a second. So you've got a congregation starting, right? Or you've got a synagogue, because these are all synagogues, all of them. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, this one here, they're all synagogues. There's no such thing as a church the way you and I understand church today. That did not exist in the first century. So these are synagogues that he's going to. And so, okay, you tell the people that he is the Messiah. You show them through the scripture. And then what's the second thing you tell them? Or what's the second most important thing you need to tell them? Well, what Messiah told you, the temple's coming down. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. You've got to realize what an moment that must have been to try to teach people these things. Now, when we read it in the Gospels, we're going to take a quick look at it again. My question is, and what I want you guys to think, because I really do think that this is the issue in the first century, because you and I, 2,000 years later, we can look back, and they always say you have 20/20 hindsight. When you're past an event, it's much easier to look back and find all the errors. And when it comes to football, we say, Monday morning quarterback. The guy at the couch on Monday can tell you all the terrible things the quarterback did, but he wasn't there playing at the time, so he didn't know. Well, we can see things now 2,000 years later that they couldn't see. They were living it in real time. And it sounds like when you read Thessalonians and others, and when you read the words of Yeshua out of Matthew, Luke, and Mark, it sounds like the coming of the Master, the second coming of the Master, splitting open the sky, coming in all his glory, the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens, coming with his angels and a shout. And there's only like 2 verses that give us that information out of chapters that are talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And those 2 verses are important. It's talking to us about the coming of the Master. But when you read it, it sounds like the coming of the Master in all of his glory is attached to the destruction of the temple. It says right after, then following. They had no concept of 2,000 years that would go on between the destruction of Jerusalem and where we are today. They had absolutely no concept of it. They knew they were supposed to go from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the world. And, that's what Paul did, and others with him. They did. They went out to the Roman world. But they had no concept that the world would expand and multiply. And today, I don't know, just under 8 billion people on the planet. They had no concept of that. And so I really think that when they spoke of the destruction of Jerusalem, which they absolutely did, how can you not speak of that when Yeshua spent so much time telling the disciples about that? That would have been something you eventually taught to whatever synagogues you were at, Maybe not the first thing, because the first thing you want to let them know is Yeshua is Messiah. But as you're sitting and you're talking and you're going through the scripture, people are going to ask, and you're going to tell them what happened that day when they sat outside the temple, the day, just days before the master died. Listen to the amazing things he said about the temple and about Jerusalem. And of course, remember, Yeshua is talking about that generation. Now, I want you to think about something, because I want you to sort of, what's the right way of saying this? Put ourselves in their shoes for a second. So, all right, you're going to go and you're going to tell people about Yeshua Messiah. And you're going to open up the scripture and you're going to go to the Psalms. You're going to go to the prophets. You're going to go to the Torah. You're going to show them, as Saul does many, many times, why Messiah had to suffer and die and be resurrected, right? So he does that. But imagine, if you would, you're a first century person in a synagogue. You believe in Yah. You may be under the whole Pharisaic thing, but you believe in Yah, and these people come to your congregation, and they talk to you about this Yeshua, who you've heard of before. You heard the stories. You heard what was going on in Jerusalem. It's interesting. He opens up the scriptures, and he shows you this is why and this is why, and so you believe. And then he says to you, maybe weeks later, maybe months later, as he's just teaching and opening up the word there in the synagogue on each Sabbath, and then excuse me, guys, and then Saul or Silas or Peter or whomever, any one of the apostles, then they sit down on a Sabbath and they start telling you about the day that we sat with Messiah, about all of the days leading up to his crucifixion, and the parable of the vineyard, and the parable of the wedding, and the woes, and Matthew 24. And they start going through all that stuff. And they tell you the temple's coming down. Not just the temple, there's not going to be one stone left upon it. Jerusalem itself is going to be destroyed. A horrific desolation is coming in. Ultimately, Jerusalem is going to be a wasteland. Ultimately, there's going to be a scattering of all the Jewish people. You have to understand how crazy that sounds, or that would have sounded to people in the first century. And I guess I said this with someone else over this weekend. The best equivalent that I could give you so that we can wrap our minds around what they must have been experiencing is, imagine if before 9/11, 40 some odd years before 9/11 occurred, before the planes into the Twin Towers, into the Pentagon, the flight 90 or 93 that in Pennsylvania that crashed, before any of that happened, that a preacher said the Twin Towers are coming down. A preacher in America said the Twin Towers are going to come down, and they're going to come down violently, and not one stone will be left upon another of those buildings. Now, that's the symbol of American power and might and finance, right? Across the whole globe. If you were to say that 40 years before, and say, some, religious zealots of another religion are going to do this, who hate this nation, you'd look at the person as a preacher and say, you're a fool. That's not going to happen. That's how can you say that? How could you even imagine something like that? And 5 years after you make that prophet, after you proclaim something like that, and it didn't happen yet, people who heard you say it are going to start saying, "Oh yeah, well, where's this? Where's this? Twin Tower thing? It's still up, and it's there. It's in New York, and you're just one of those crazy religious kooks." And then 10 years later, still nothing happens. And then 20 years later, still nothing happens. And then 30 years later, now the scoffing is just, it's unbearable, because you're considered a fool. There's no way this can happen. And then you start seeing all the things that he said are supposed to happen before this tower comes down, and they all start happening. You're all getting a little nervous. Okay, well, and then finally 40 years later, the towers come down. I know it's a horrible example. It's a real historical event for us. But as devastated as we were as a nation over the Twin Towers coming down, and it was horrific, that by volumes of emotion beyond what that was a destruction of the temple. Because the temple was not just a financial icon for the world. It was the house of Elohim. It was the place where Elohim dwelt. It was in the capital, the city that Elohim chose. It was the very physical representation of heaven, because that's what the Temple Mount is. It's called a heaven. You ascend to heaven when you go and make Aliyah 3 times a year. What you're doing is you are ascending the mountain. You are making Aliyah. You are going up, but you are going up to heaven. The temple was considered a type of heaven, the throne room of God. And here's Messiah saying, this temple is going to be destroyed. Please wrap your mind around how devastating a statement that is. And then when the actual history occurs, as horrible as modern day tragedies have been, 1 million people lose their lives in and around Jerusalem at this one event. Beloved, this is absolutely a game changer. This is mind-boggling. And yet, from the time Messiah said it to the time that it happens is over 40 years. So you've got the disciples now who are definitely telling them the first part. Number one, Messiah came, he died, he rose again. He's ascended to the Father. He is the sacrifice for sin. Oh, and by the way, the temple's going to be destroyed. And Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And he's going to get rid of all of the priesthood, all of that. And we know that is absolutely the information that was told to these congregations. It has to be. You're going to find out as we go through Thessalonians. Paul told them all this. He revealed all of this to them. We know this because this is what the whole book of Hebrews is about. Hebrews is about, they know the temple is going to be destroyed. Now, whether it was destroyed before Hebrews or after, you can argue back and forth on the dates. But the way the writer of Hebrews is writing, he knows that whole system is done. The Son has come. The greater sacrifice has come. So, and that's part of the teaching, why it has to go. It's been a harlot. It's been a type. It's not because the covenant was bad. It's because the people were bad. The priests were bad. So this is definitely part of the conversation of the first century. It's just when we read the words that are related to it, we assume that those words are talking about the second coming of Messiah and not the destruction of the temple. And we've got to be able to differentiate between those words. Here is just some of. I'm not going to do a parallel side by side because we went through this story already. But here's just some of the words, because just to sort of give us a run. Because there's another point I want to make before we actually get into the book. Luke 21:34. Listen to what it says. Take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighted down by gluttony and drunkenness and the worries of this life. And that day, what day? The day of the destruction of Jerusalem, because that's what the whole topic of everything's about. And what we read, though, when we read that, is, oh, he's talking about the day of his second coming. No, that's not the day he's referring to. He's referring to the day Jerusalem gets destroyed, the abomination when Jerusalem is surrounded. That day he's talking about. And he says that day will come upon you suddenly. It's going to come quick. Now, granted, 40 years, maybe from our perspective, is not quick, but in the realm of God and time, my goodness, that's like instantaneous. And it is within their lifetimes. And guys, how quick does time go by for us? So he tells them That day will come upon you suddenly. Says the same thing in Matthew 24. He says, like lightning, suddenly, quickly, fast, from the east to the west. And again, I know that's a verse that we often look at and we think he's talking about the second coming, because it says the coming of the Son of Man. But it's not the second coming. It's not the Son of Man in glory. It's not the Son of Man splitting the sky. It's not the sign of the Son of Man. This is like lightning, judgment coming, the wrath of the Lamb, like lightning from east to west, which is, by the way, the direction Rome came from, because they came from Edom. They went over the mountains of Jordan. They went from the east to the west and got to Jerusalem and destroyed it. And as far as, military goes, it was pretty quick. Verse 35, he says, for it shall come as a snare on all those dwelling on the face of all the earth. And again, we're thinking, he's talking about the whole planet. No, he's talking about Jerusalem, the house of Israel, the Middle East, because it was Rome controlled all of it there. But the land we are concerned with, or the land the master is concerned with, is the earth, the land, the inheritance given to the house of Israel. So it's kind of deceiving when we read it in the English, the whole earth. We're thinking the whole globe. No, it means the whole land that God gave them. Watch then at all times and pray that you be counted worthy to escape. So he's telling those people of that day, those disciples, those apostles, and anybody living in Jerusalem that knows the number 1 point and now has been informed of the number 2 point, watch. Watch, this is going to be real important. Watch at all times, because life's going to go on and things are going to happen. And he's telling them, don't get weighed down. Don't start getting, right, you've got a wife, you may have kids, you may be living, but don't get so involved in what life is doing that you don't recognize that the day is coming, because when it comes, it's going to come quickly. So when you see the wars and rumors of wars and all the other stuff going on in Jerusalem, know that it's coming. And pray that you be counted worthy to escape all that is about to take place. Same thing is written in the book of Revelation in chapter 18 when it says, come out of her, my people, so that you do not partake in her sins. Well, if you see all of these things coming and you're not watching, and you've gotten involved in, whatever life has involved for you, and all of a sudden you're there on the day of Passover, because it's Passover, and the priests are telling you Messiah is with us. There's another guy who claims to be Messiah. He's out in the wilderness, and he's got an army, and there's 3 other guys inside Jerusalem, and there's a guy in the temple, and they're all saying the temple, the temple, the temple. We've got the temple. And you believe that, and you stay in Jerusalem while it's surrounded. Well, you are in for the next 5 months of horror until the final destruction comes. That's what he's saying. So he's saying, pray that you be found worthy to get out, to not partake of this. Parallel verses, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 27, which are saying the same exact thing. Listen to this. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines to the west, not the second coming. I know that's how we look at it. I know that's the way we learned it. I know that's the way we've heard it before, but that is not what he's talking about. As lightning shines from the east to the west, so also the coming of the Son of Adam will be. So there it is. He says the coming of the Son of Adam. He didn't say the second coming. He didn't say trumpets and angels and gathering everybody. He's still talking about the judgment upon Jerusalem. And here's how we know. Look, for wherever the dead body is, there the vultures shall be gathered together. Now, you're going to see in a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you some scriptures out of Jeremiah. Messiah is actually quoting the book of Jeremiah here. He is quoting the book of Jeremiah and the description of what happened the first time Jerusalem was destroyed. And Jeremiah laments over it. The master is just using Jeremiah's testimony, and he's using it to say this is going to happen again. And where all of these dead bodies are, as the winepress of the wrath of God is poured out, and there's blood up to a bridle horse, there are going to be birds feasting on everybody, Roman and Jew at the same time. That's what he's talking about. So watch, as lightning shines from the east to the west, for wherever the dead body is, there the vultures shall be gathered together, Then verse 29, and we talked about immediately last week. And immediately, or better translated, not immediately, but following. Following after the distress, the tribulation. So we already talked about one tribulation, right? That's what the disciples go through leading up to this. Here's now the Great Tribulation. And after the distress, the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give its light. Now, I've heard a whole lot of interpretations, got a whole lot of studies over the years as to the sun and the moon, and we're always looking for solar eclipses and what's that called when the moons are red? I forgot what it is, a tetrad. I don't, understanding the historical events, I don't think he's talking about any of that. I don't think he's talking about an actual sign in the sun and an actual sign in the moon. And though there's some records of, there was the comet that came by and all the rest of that, but I think what he's saying is the sun and the moon will not give its light. Well, biblically, what's the sun and the moon? It's the house of Israel. There is a woman who gave birth, and she had the sun and the moon and the stars around her. Go back to Joseph's dream. He dreams a dream of the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him. The sun and the moon and the stars is the house of Israel. This is telling us at the destruction of Jerusalem, the light that was supposed to be coming from the sun and the moon and the stars is not going to come anymore. Jerusalem's going to be desolate. It's not going to be there anymore. A new children will be birthed. A new nation will be birthed. But it's not going to be in Jerusalem, and it's not going to be in the temple. And Yeshua tells us the same thing when he says, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship, but you will worship in spirit and in truth, for that is how the Father is seeking to be worshiped. That's what he's talking about here. This is what I believe he's talking about here. And even the idea of the stars shall fall from heaven. Well, who are the stars? Well, Abraham, look up, count the stars. So shall your seed be. And the seed, the Jews, are going to fall from the sky. This is the same thing that's written in Revelation chapter 12. Satan takes a third of the stars and he throws them to the ground. It's not angels that he's throwing to the ground. He's throwing the stars. He's throwing Jews. He's trampling the saints. He's killing the people in Jerusalem. He's killing real people that really do love Yah, but they didn't understand who Yeshua was, or they rejected it, and they're in trouble. They're there believing in the temple, but that wrath is going to come on them because they did not get out of the harlot in time. So that's what I think it really means about the sun and the moon being darkened and the stars falling from heaven. Again, this is all Revelation 12. And what you find out is Revelation 12 is really this story over and over and over again. There's actually 18 chapters about the destruction of Jerusalem and one chapter, and it's not even the whole chapter, one chapter about the second coming. 18 chapters about the destruction of Jerusalem, one chapter about the second coming, which kind of gives you what's the emphasis here. The emphasis is the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the pivotal point in all of history. And all the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. 2,000 years. It's been, it's been the times of the Gentiles for 2,000 years. The next verse, then after that great tribulation, the next verse, and this is the verse. So you've got chapter 19, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and now 24, all talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, here's the one verse, or two verses, Matthew 24:30. And then what? And then, or following, the sun and the moon and the stars get no light. The sun and the moon, no light. The stars get cast down. The powers of heaven are shaken. Luke says it a little bit differently. All the nations raging, fear in the hearts of men. After all of that, which we now know is 2,000 years, but when you read it in Matthew, it sounds like the next thing attached to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then the sign of the son of Adam will appear in the heaven, and all the tribes of the earth shall mourn. And they shall see the Son of Adam coming on the clouds of heaven with power and much glory. And he shall send his messengers with a great sound of a trumpet. We're going to see that Saul's going to talk about this later on in Thessalonians. When we get there, we'll come back to this. And they shall gather together his chosen from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. That's the second coming. That's the only verses in Matthew 24 that deal with the second coming. Everything else in Matthew 24 is about the destruction of Jerusalem and all the events surrounding it, the birth pangs. In Matthew, the next thing it says then, so learn the parable of the fig tree. When you see all of these things coming, when the fig tree is ripe, in other words, wars and rumors of wars and the tribulation the saints are going to go through, and then Jerusalem surrounded, when you see all of that, the generation that sees all of that, that generation will not pass away until all is fulfilled. That generation was that generation, not some generation off in the future. And then he goes back to the narrative, not of the second coming, but of the day of the Lord, the day of vengeance, the day of wrath. Verse 36 now says, but concerning the day of vengeance, the day the temple will be destroyed, not the day he splits the sky and descends with his angels. The day of vengeance is the topic here. But concerning the day of vengeance, but concerning that day and the hour, no one knows, not even the messengers of the heavens, but my Father only. Now you could say, well, nobody knows the second coming of the Master as well. Yeah, granted, that's absolutely true, but that's not what this is talking about. And while that may be true, we cannot just add we can't add subject material and jam it into what the writer's talking about. He's clearly going back, after describing the fig tree, going back to that generation that will see all of these things. When is this going to happen? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Not even the angels in heaven, but Father only. Then he goes into and I didn't write it all out just for time's sake for today. You guys got your Bibles. You guys can look all of this up. Then he goes into talking about Lot and Noah as the example of nobody knowing. Now, we often look at the Lot and the Noah example as the second coming, that when he comes, he's going to come and he's going to take us out, and horrible judgment is going to fall. Well, yeah, that is the story of Lot and that is the story of Noah, but he's not attaching it to the second coming. He's attaching it to the destruction of Jerusalem. That just like in the days of Lot, Yah is going to send for his people to get out. And it just so happens it's at Passover when this occurs. When Rome comes in, which is the same time that Lot was doing his thing. It was during the season of Passover when the two angels come to Lot. Well, it's during Passover that Rome surrounds Jerusalem. And those that got out before, well, they did not suffer what Sodom and Gomorrah suffered, but Jerusalem did suffer fire and horror and death and et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing with Noah. He didn't know, he didn't know when it was coming. He knew it was coming, and he prepared for it, and he gets out, and everybody else dies. These are not the examples of the resurrection, because the resurrection, and then after that, then he goes into the one is taken, and the other is left. Two are in the field. One is taken. Two are grinding. One is taken. One is on the rooftop. One is taken. That's not resurrection. He's talking about escaping. One escapes, the other doesn't. Like Lot escaped, like Noah escaped, like the disciples escaped, like the apostles escaped. And actually, if we read in Luke, he makes that very, very clear. He tells us that, if you're on the roof, don't go down and get your stuff. If you're out in the field, don't go back and to your house. Well, here it is. One will be taken from the field, one from the rooftop, two will be grinding. Again, this is not a resurrection verse, but this is the wrath of the Lamb verse, which I know throws a monkey wrench in everything you've probably ever heard, ever conceived of, ever thought. But in its proper context, this story is so important to understand what's going on in Thessalonica. So this is the stuff that's on people's mind. So the next verses now, the next verses in Matthew and in Mark, the comparative chapter, the next thing after the Lot and the Noah and one taken and one left, is now verse 42. And again, he goes back to the watch, just like he told him before. Watch for this day. He's to let us know he's still talking about the same subject. He's telling about the whole one taken, one not taken. Watch, therefore. Watch. Now, of course, we've taken it as we need to watch. We're looking for the signs and this and that. Well, all it tells us about the second coming from this perspective, I'm only talking about right here in Matthew. There is more information in other places, but I'm only talking about right here in Matthew in this conversation. The only thing he gives us as a reference is you'll see the sign of the Son of Man in the sky, splitting the sky open. That's the only thing to watch for. So when he's talking about watch, he's not talking about watch for that. He's talking about watch for the wars, the rumors, the persecution you're going to go under. Then when you see Jerusalem surrounded, that's the watching he's saying to watch for. So verse 42, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your master is coming. Again, the master is coming for wrath. Messiah is coming. It may not be him in glory coming, but he's coming using the vessel of Rome. He's coming in wrath and vengeance and indignation like he has done before in the past, except this time is different. This time is complete desolation until the end. So he says, you don't know what hour your master is coming, and know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour, and here it is, because you see it here, and when we read this, we don't quite get what he's saying. If he knew what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house, the temple, to be broken into. This is Yeshua referencing a cultural temple event that went on from time to time called a thief in the night. We'll get more into that a little bit later, into some of its historical thing. But the thief in the night, see now in our modern culture, we look at this, and there's, you guys remember the movies called The Thief in the Night. There's a couple of them out there called The Thief in the Night, and it's always about the second coming of the master. Except the master's not coming as a thief in the night when he comes for the second time. He's coming as a glorious conquering king. There will be no thief part to it. It's not going to be the way it's being described here. Plus, it's not going to have anything to do with his house. This has to do with the house, with the temple that you watch so that your house is not broken into. Mark chapter 13. In verse 35, which is a complementary verse to this one, listen to what this says. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house, the temple, Yeshua is the master of the house, when he is coming. In the evening, or at midnight, or at the crowing of the cock, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly, which is what he said, like lightning from the east to the west, lest coming suddenly he should find you. And this is another term that's associated with a thief in the night. If he finds you in his house, sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, watch. And of course, he's talking about those disciples right then and there. You guys don't get lazy. You guys don't get into gluttony. You guys don't do any of that. You pray that you be found worthy to escape what's coming. You guys get out when you see Jerusalem surrounded. You guys. It's all about you guys. So the whole reference to the house being broken into, the hour he would come, the thief in the night, find you sleeping, these are all terms associated with the temple practice of, or what becomes known as a thief in the night. And we'll get into more of that. I talked about that a couple of weeks ago. You guys can honestly just look it up. There's so much information, online about that. You guys can just look it up. But we'll talk about it later, because that's going to be another term that's going to be used in the book of Thessalonians. Problem is, when you read it in Thessalonians, when we're reading it, most think he's talking about the second coming. But he's quoting what Messiah is saying here, and this is not attached to the second coming. This is attached to the day of judgment, the day of the wrath of the Lamb upon Jerusalem. And that makes a whole big difference. All right, let's some definitions. We went over this before, but here's some really important definitions. Just want to say hello to everybody that's joined us tonight. Thank you so much, guys, for hanging out with me tonight. I appreciate it. Here are just some basic definitions. We should already know these. Like over the last few weeks, we've gone over these. These are very important in order to understand Thessalonians. We have to know what the day of vengeance is, or the day of the Lord, the day of Yah. It is the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the destruction of the temple. It's the destruction of the priest for murder. It's the day of the avenger of blood. That's what the day of the Lord is. Tribulation. This is a really important definition because it's going to come up for today. The first part of tribulation, because when you listen to a lot of the end time stuff, they say, well, there's tribulation and then there's great tribulation. And technically there is, if you're going to use the English words, but the word means distress, persecution, hard times. And there's two segments that Yeshua does talk about. He talks about the tribulation the disciples will go through, what they will suffer before they start seeing wars and rumors of wars and all the rest of that, leading to the Jerusalem being surrounded. So tribulation, its biblical definition is the persecution of the Netzarim by the Jews. It's the persecution of the Netzarim by the Jews, by the synagogue of Satan, very often by their own families. Then there is the Great Tribulation, and this is really a time frame, whether you call it tribulation or distress or persecution, depending upon what version you might want to use. But the Great Tribulation is what happens at the destruction of Jerusalem. So it begins with the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, 1 million people dying, the winepress of the wrath of God being poured out, and then the diaspora, the sun and the moon not giving its light any longer, the stars of heaven falling on the ground. That is part of the Great Tribulation, and Jerusalem being trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles is over, which has been about 2,000 years. So how long has Great Tribulation been going on? Not a 7-year period. It's been going on for 2,000 years. And you see this when we get into Revelation and we look at the seals, when you read about the 144,000, and then you read about the every tribe, nation, and tongue, all of these people. And John says, where'd they come from? And he says, they came out of Great Tribulation. Who? Every nation, every tongue, every tribe. Those people, they made it through the 2,000 years, and they are there resurrected before the Master. So that is, I guess you could say, it's a time slot. It's a technical description of a passage of time, but it's not a 7-year passage. It's not even a 3.5-year passage. To date, it's 2,000 years of trial, of tribulation, of persecution, of the diaspora, of no sun, no moon, no stars, the powers of heaven being shaken, men's hearts failing them, and all the other things that have gone on. So really important definition. And of course, we just said the thief in the night. Thief in the night is the temple being destroyed. You must be watching, and you cannot be sleeping. But we'll get back to that another time. And then, after all of that stuff, after all of that happens, then the sign of the Son of Man appears. Then the shofar blast. Then in his glory within the clouds, sending his angels and catching up, resurrecting all of his people. The Great Exodus is really what we're reading about there, the Great Exodus. That's the order. And these are the definitions, and they are very, very important. So, believe it or not, we are actually going to start reading Thessalonians tonight. We probably won't get too far, but we're going to read some of Thessalonians tonight. So here is Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 1. Again, I'm reading out of the Scriptures version, so you guys can either follow along or just keep up with us on the notes. But here we go. It says, Shaul and Silas and Timotheus, to the assembly of the Thessalonians in Elohim, the Father and the Master, Yeshua Messiah. And I really like the way the Scriptures version puts that sentence together, because it's much different than when you read it in some of the other plain English versions. Because when you read this, what it's actually saying, or what Saul is actually saying, is to the Thessalonians, who are in God, who is the Father and the Master, Yeshua Messiah. Not that who is in God the Father and the Master, Yeshua Messiah, which then separates them. The way that they have it here, you see that when he says Elohim, he's speaking of the both of them. So I think that's just something interesting I noticed before. I wanted to point out to you guys. So here it is. Favor to you and peace from Elohim our Father and the Master Yeshua Messiah. We give thanks to Elohim always for you all, making mention of you in our prayers, remembering without ceasing your work of faith, your work of belief. So it's not just belief, it's work of belief. That's just something a little bit extra. And the labor of love, and the endurance of the expectation in our Master, Yeshua Messiah, in the presence of our Elohim and Father, knowing, brothers, beloved by Elohim, that you were chosen. So you got to remember that this is a synagogue that he's talking to, or people that were from a synagogue. Because our good news did not come to you in word only, but also in power, and in the set-apart spirit, and in entire confirmation, as you know what kind of men we were among you. So he's talking about their witness, how they learned the scripture, how they got it for your sake. Now, I want you to look at verse 6, because it's really, 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 really important. It says, and you became imitators of us and of the Master, having received the word in much pressure. And I put in yellow there, that's the PDP version. You receive the word in much tribulation, in much trial, with joy of the set-apart spirit, so that you became an example to all who believe in Macedonia and Achaia. Okay, so I highlight that, and I put it in yellow there so that you guys could see that he's telling them, when we came to you, when we first started ministering to you, the pressure started. The tribulation started, which is exactly what Yeshua said. You're going to go out, you're going to minister this gospel, they're going to do all sorts of things, you're going to be going through tribulation, and then after, you're going to see wars and rumors and all the rest of that. Well, here's Paul, this is what he's referring to. That tribulation has started. Their aspect of tribulation has started. Well, what exactly is he referring to? Well, we need to get some historical background. As you know, everything's historical. Everything's context. Context, context, context. In Acts chapter 17 is the story of Thessalonica, of how this congregation comes to be. And this comes off the heels of chapter 15, when Gentiles are starting to come in and what to do with them. And then they go out. This is the second missionary journey of the apostle. And he brings with him Silas and Timothy. Same guy, Silas, that he wound up in prison with, getting flogged at Philippi, all, you know. So Paul's been going through tribulation. And this has got to be at least 15, 20 years after Messiah. So think about it. For 15, 20 years before Paul even started preaching to these people at Thessalonica, they've been telling people about the number one aspect of it, Messiah, the Elohim of the Bible, became flesh, died, rose again, all right? But it's also been 10 years of telling people, temple's coming down. The temple's coming down. The day of the Lord is coming. The wrath of the Lamb is coming, and splitting the sky, and the trumpet and resurrection and all the rest of that. Because again, I believe from their perspective, they're thinking it's all interconnected, because that's how it looks when you read Matthew, and you wouldn't know it unless you're 2,000 years later, and you can put in 2020 hindsight. So here's, so chapter 17, they finally get to the place where Thessalonica is. It says, and having passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a congregation a synagogue. This started in a synagogue. Now, it leaves that particular synagogue, and they have to come up with their own place eventually, maybe a house or some other thing, but this starts in a synagogue, the synagogue of the Jews. And according to his practice, Shaul went in unto them, and for 3 Sabbaths was reasoning with them from the scriptures. So, he's ministering, right? He's trying to tell them, he's trying to show them that Yeshua is indeed the Messiah of the Bible. He's trying to prove it from the Torah, from the prophets, from the Psalms, explaining and pointing out that the Messiah had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this is the Messiah, Yeshua, who I proclaim to you. So he's proclaiming point 1, again, which is exactly what you do. You do first things first, right? That's the first thing you got to know. Whom I proclaim to you, verse 4. And some of them did believe. So some of the people in the synagogue absolutely believe. He's talking about Jews that believed. Of course, one of them we're going to find out is a young man named Jason. But these are Jews that believed. It says, and a large number of the worshiping Greeks or Gentiles. Now, it's important that you realize it says worshiping Gentiles. So yes, Gentiles are coming in, but the Gentiles he's talking about are not, and there are times when this happens too, but these are not Gentiles who were just out in the pagan world, celebrating Zeus and Apollo and all the rest of that stuff. These were believing, worshiping Gentiles, either proselytes or maybe they were just God-fearers, but they were worshiping Gentiles. And so they knew some of the stories. They knew the Torah. If they were worshiping Gentiles, they had been part of that synagogue for a while. They may not have been allowed in. They would have maybe on the outside, but they heard enough to hear. And so these other worshiping Gentiles are also listening. And it says, and not a few of the leading women. So you've got the men who are the proselytes, you got women, and you got the Jews there, both men and women, some of which, doesn't give us a percentage, but some that got it, that understood what the master was talking about. They joined Shaul and Silas. But, and here's the synagogue of Satan. This is the synagogue of Satan. But the Yehudim, the Jews, who thought, I put this in yellow because this will remind you of something later, who thought they were doing Elohim a service. They didn't want to believe what Saul said. They wanted to believe whatever, their rabbi, whatever Pharisaic or temple traditions that they believed in. They didn't want to believe that this was indeed the Messiah. They maybe heard many other people claim to be Messiah, but not like this. So they didn't believe. But the Yehudim, who thought they were doing God a service, who did not believe, having become envious, they were not his sheep. And don't forget, if these are people from the synagogue, these are the family and friends and acquaintances of both the Jews who did believe and of the proselytes who were worshipers of Elohim. Took some of the wicked men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar, and came upon the house of Jason, and were seeking to bring them out to the people. So what's starting off kicking off right off the bat, as soon as this gospel, as soon as this message of who Yeshua is being ministered to the synagogue, what's the first thing that goes on? Synagogue of Satan, gets it all in an uproar and starts causing a major problem. Tribulation starts, hardship starts, distress starts, whatever word you want to use. But what Messiah said was going to happen as this message goes out in my name is happening to them before Jerusalem is surrounded, just like the Master said it would happen. Verse 6, it says, but not finding them, they didn't find Paul and Shaul and Silas, but not finding them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers, Jews, other Jews, to the city rulers. So they dragged these people out of their house, dragged them before the magistrates of the city, crying out, they who have turned the whole world upside down have come here too. So they heard about this. This is like 20 years after Messiah. So, it's not like it's been out there. People have heard about this. And so they're saying, oh, these are the guys. These are the ones we've heard of. Just mess. These are the ones the priest, don't want anything to do with. These are the ones the priests send people out to gather up and kill and bring them back to Jerusalem, not realizing maybe Saul was one of those guys. And don't think Saul was the only guy that they commissioned to go do that. They probably commissioned lots of people to go out and do what Saul did, gathering up the believers, the Netzarim, and bringing them back to Jerusalem. We only get Saul's story, but he was not the only Pharisee out there doing that kind of stuff. It's naive to think that. So here they are. These are the people that have turned the world upside down and have come here too, whom Jason has received. So they're calling these Netzarim, they're calling Saul and them heretics. You guys aren't Jewish. They're not of the synagogue of Satan in this particular context. And all of them are acting contrary to the dogmas of Caesar, which is interesting because they're not using Torah here. They're going for a political persecution, saying there is another king besides Caesar, Yeshua. And in that day, in that setting, that would have been treason. And that would have been taken very, very seriously. If there really was someone who was proclaiming themselves king, that person would have been killed. And you see the same thing play out in the gospel stories with the master. It says, and they troubled the crowd and the city rulers when they heard this. And when they had received a pledge from Jason, they fined him. They made him pay. They made him pay a fine. Made him pay a fine. And not just him, all the other Jews that they grabbed with them, who were the believers who listened to what Saul said, grabbed them, and he made them all pay fines. And then they let them go. So they didn't take the whole Caesar thing, Yeshua being king, that seriously. But you did cause a ruckus. You're here in front of the council. We got to pay for our time. So they fined them. But who did this? Who started this? The Jews in the synagogue. The Jews who did not believe in the synagogue, who thought they were doing Yah a service by persecuting these people. So right off the bat, this congregation in Thessalonica, from a familial perspective, they're behind the eight ball. Things are going to be tough for them, and it's not going to get any easier. And then wait till they start hearing the message that Yeshua taught, that Saul obviously knows about Matthew 19 and 20 and 21, and wait till they hear that stuff and see how things actually get for them. And then they go back to their family members and try to share that stuff with them. Here's verse 10. It goes on, the account in the book of Acts, chapter 17. Here's verse 10. It says, and the brothers immediately sent Saul and Silas away by night to Berea. So they got the guys out of the town, who having come, again, so these guys go to the next town over, and they go where? Right back to the synagogue, to the Jews, to begin to minister. Because who's the one people who are going to get this quicker than anybody else? The Jews, and understand, all of it, or should understand as they go through the scripture. They went into the synagogue, the congregation of the Yehudim. Now, these were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They were more open-minded. They were willing to look at the scripture, and if they're wrong, admit that they're wrong and want to learn and understand, as we all should be. We are not all like that, but as we all should be. Who received the word with great eagerness and searched the scriptures, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms daily, to see if these words were so. So they're testing what Saul is saying, as he's saying, well, Isaiah spoke of this. What Isaiah meant was this, because this is what actually happened. So that's what they're doing. It says, verse 12, then many of them, the Jews in that synagogue. So now a new Netzarim congregation is starting. Where? In a synagogue. Truly believed. And also not a few of the Greeks. Now, I put in there proselytes, though it doesn't actually say that, but I would imagine it was proselytes. But even if it's not, let's just say it's just, pagans that happened to hurt here and they came, great. It doesn't matter. But this is the core where this is starting off with is out of the synagogue, just like in Thessalonica. Now, verse 13 says, and when the Jews of Thessalonica came, so they weren't just happy with kicking them out of Thessalonica. These Jews were so upset, so pissed off, that they wanted to hunt these guys down and make it hard for them. Tribulation wherever they went. And when the Yehudim from Thessalonica came to know that the word of Elohim, Yeshua Messiah, died, resurrected, was proclaimed by Saul at Berea, they came there also and stirred up the crowds. And then immediately the brothers sent Saul away to go to the sea, but both Silas, who, by the way, Silas is from Jerusalem, right? He was a leader in Jerusalem. He was with the apostles who were with Messiah in Matthew 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. Don't you think Silas knew the story? Don't you think obviously Saul must have known the story by now, but Silas knew the story. They just came from Jerusalem, right? They just came from Acts chapter 15. These guys, they knew the whole story. And so they leave Silas and Timothy behind. So this brand new congregation is starting, this brand new fellowship made up of Jews and proselytes that now I would imagine are going to wind up getting kicked out of their synagogue. Their own family members, their own friends, their own co-workers have become the synagogue of Satan, and they're following Paul and Silas to try to keep the persecution up. Could you imagine what life must have been like for these people? Because, listen, we have a percentage of that today. We come, we understand, we get, some issues and trouble with family, that want to hear it, some don't. But, we don't have a culture. We don't really live in a community sense the way they did back then. Each person reliant upon the next person, generations reliant upon generations, and all the tradition, and all of a sudden you stray from that, or it seems like you're straying from that. And to them, it seems like you're straying away from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when you're not. You're actually coming to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Could you imagine the persecution they must have been under? Could you imagine the trial and the tribulation they must have been under? If they were willing to grab Jonas and other Jews and drag them before the court, what else were they willing to do? As this thing started to grow, as more and more people started to come, as they saw their sons and their daughters not following in the traditions of the priest, in the traditions of their rabbi, but now listening to Timothy and Silas and Saul, and letters would be sent later. Could just imagine the hardship. And it's not just going on here in Thessalonica, it's going on in every congregation, because every congregation starts as a synagogue. It's going on in every congregation as people are being split up. The name Messiah, the name Yeshua, is splitting people up. This is the tribulation Messiah was speaking about. Here's just a little bit, a couple of verses. I can give you lots and lots more, but here's just a couple of verses where Yeshua describes these events. John 16:2. He says, they shall put you out of the congregations, out of the synagogues. But an hour is coming when everyone who kills you shall think that he is rendering service to Elohim. Well, there you go. There it is. Messiah was telling them at this juncture, before his death and resurrection, this is coming to you guys. And they shall do this to you because they do not know the Father nor me. Luke 21:12. But before all this, before the wars and rumors and wars and yada, 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 they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. Well, we've already seen that in the life of Saul, but Saul times all the other believers is going on as well, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, and it shall turn out for a witness. That's what's happening. That's tribulation. Luke 21, verse 16. And you shall also be betrayed by parents and brothers and relatives and friends. And some of you shall be put to death, and you shall be hated by all because of my name. And that's exactly what started the congregation at Thessalonica. And don't think it got any easier as the weeks and the years rolled on. It did not. It got worse and worse. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 9, then they shall deliver you up to affliction, tribulation, and kill you. And you shall be hated by all nations for my name's sake. This is what's going on in Thessalonica. This is how the congregation starts. This is tribulation, not the Great Tribulation yet. That starts from the time of the destruction of Jerusalem on. But right now it's the tribulation against the Netzarim, the children born from the woman. Luke chapter 12 and verse 51. Do not think that I came to give peace on earth. I say to you, no, but rather division. For from now on, 5 in one house shall be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. Father shall be divided against son, and son against father. Mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Guys, these are Yeshua's words. He knew this was coming. He knew this time of great turmoil was going to come amongst the people of Israel, amongst the Jews, amongst the scattered sheep of the house of Israel, because so many of them are involved in the temple, in their synagogue, in the traditions of the fathers, and some will have ears to hear. They may all be called, but some will be chosen. And that's going to cause great animosity, and it does. In all of their lives. But I want you to realize this is the setting of the book of Thessalonians. I mean, think about the worst day possible happening every day, day after day, week after week, shunned, hated, friends you had that were stoned to death because of what you believe. That's mind-boggling to me, absolutely mind-boggling. And that's what these people were going through. So the order. Why is the order so important? With all the stuff that we kind of went over. Well, now you know what tribulation is. You can better understand what the Thessalonians are going through. And then you'll understand the context of the things why Paul chooses to talk about the things he talks about. Like resurrection. Why he says that. Because there were those in Thessalonica who were killed, who were murdered for their faith. And so he's encouraging them, and he gives us the whole, of course, the whole resurrection thing. I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, about those who are dead in Messiah. When we get there, we'll talk more about that. But I want you to understand now the context. They were suffering through tribulation, not the way we think about it in end time studies today, but real hardship, real issues. So the order is important. Messiah's death and resurrection. The apostles' tribulation, wars, rumors of wars, pestilence, etc. Jerusalem surrounded, the day of Yah, like east to the west, lightning. Then the great tribulation, the scattering, the diaspora, and the scattering of the Netzarim throughout the world. And then the Son of Man in his glory on the clouds. But we now know all of these things are interconnected, quite literally, maybe not one right after the other in time frame, but in sequence, one right after the other. But we now know the difference between the Great Tribulation starting at the destruction of Jerusalem, and we haven't seen Yeshua come in clouds of glory. It's been 2,000 years. So we now know that gap is at least that long. This is the same format, this same format. And so think about it. So all of these chapters about the destruction of Jerusalem and one verse about you'll see him coming in glory. All of these chapters about the destruction of Jerusalem and 2 verses about seeing him in glory. What's the emphasis? Him coming in glory or the destruction of the temple? The destruction of the temple is the emphasis. And it's not to de-emphasize in any way the coming of Messiah. That is important. We'll talk about that. There is information about it. But even if you read the book of Revelation, it's written in the same format. It's 18 chapters of the destruction of Jerusalem from all sorts of different angles, but everything in it is the destruction of Jerusalem. And one chapter about the coming of Messiah. So here's the destruction of Jerusalem, Revelation 18:20. Rejoice over her, Jerusalem. This is after Mystery Babylon. 17 and 18 is the destruction of Mystery Babylon, the temple, the one in purple and gold, and etc., etc. This is Jerusalem. This is not today. This is not America. This is not the EU. It's not some global empire. This is Jerusalem. Rejoice over her. So she's been destroyed now. Babylon's been destroyed. So what does heaven do? It rejoices. The wrath of the Lamb had to come. He had to avenge the blood of all the prophets from Abel to Zechariah. Rejoice over her, over Jerusalem, O heaven, and you set apart emissaries and prophets. For Elohim has completely avenged. He is the avenger of blood. He has avenged you on her. And one mighty messenger picked up a stone like a great millstone and threw it to the sea, because it's attached to the neck of Jerusalem, right? He says, anyone who teaches my little ones, to go astray, it'd be better for a millstone to be hung around their neck and tossed into the sea. Well, this is what he was talking about. With such a rush, the great city Babel, it's called Babel here, but it's Jerusalem. The great city Babel shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more at all. And the sound of harpists and musicians and flautists and trumpeters shall not be heard in you, in the temple he's talking about, and Jerusalem, any more at all. And no craftsman of any trade shall be found in you any more at all. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you any more at all. Now, we know he's talking about Jerusalem here, because all of these words come right out of the book of Jeremiah. Here in Revelation, they're quoting Jeremiah. They're quoting Jeremiah 7:32 through 34, Jeremiah 16:9 and 25:10, which are Jeremiah speaking to the destruction of the first temple. And so Revelation are using the same words for the destruction of the first temple, so this is about the destruction of the second temple. Here's the words in Jeremiah. We're not going to go through all of them. It's too long to go through, and I'm running out of time. But here's Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 32. And it says, therefore, see, the days are coming, declares Yah, when it shall no longer be called Topheth, or the valley of Son Hinnom. Topheth is the god that they were worshiping when they were one of the places that they killed their children, where they killed the babies and they offered them up to the different gods. And it was in the valley just outside of Mount Zion. And so it was called the Valley of Topheth, because that's where all the death and idolatry was going on, or the Valley of San Hinnom, which is the valley right next to Zion, right next to the mountain where the temple is. It says, but instead it's going to be called the Valley of Slaughter, for they shall bury in Topheth, in the place where all the children's sacrifices were, for they shall bury in Topheth until no room is left. There's a lot of death coming to Jerusalem. And here it is, listen to this. And the corpses of this people shall be food for the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the earth. Wherever the body is, there the vultures will be also. I'm guilty of it too. We're all, we've all kind of gone through all the end times revelation stuff and putting it out of context, you miss all of this stuff. Now, when you see it in context, it makes sense. Messiah is quoting verses specifically, so we have that picture in our mind of what did happen and what is going to happen. Corpses with none to frighten them away. Verse 34, and in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, so you know exactly what city he's talking about, I shall make to cease the voice of rejoicing and the voice of gladness, for the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land shall become desolate, a waste. These are the words that are being spoken about in Revelation 18. So 17 and 18, so actually chapter 1 to chapter 18 is the destruction of Jerusalem. Chapter 19, however, look at what chapter 19 says, verse 2, because true and righteous are his judgments, because he has judged the great whore, Jerusalem, the temple, chapter 17 and 18, who corrupted the earth with her whoring. And he has avenged, there it is, avenged again. He's the avenger of blood. He has avenged on her the blood of his servants shed by her. So all of heaven rejoices in the beginning of chapter 19 because Jerusalem's been destroyed, but also because she's birthed other children. Then, and again, it's not even the whole chapter, but by verse 11, now look what it says. Then, and after the destruction of Jerusalem, then I saw heaven open, the sky splits open, the sign of the Son of Man, and there was a white horse. And he, Yeshua, who sat upon him was called trustworthy and true, and in righteousness he judges and fights. And his eyes were like a flame of fire, and his head were many crowns, having the name that had been written, which no one had perceived except himself, and having been dressed in the robe dipped in blood. Why is his robe dipped in blood? Jerusalem has just been destroyed. He's already churned the winepress. Why are your garments red? He already churned the winepress. He's coming out of heaven with his robes already bloodied. They're already red because that already happened in time frame 2,000 years ago, but we're seeing it here. This event already happened. Chapter 18. Dipped in blood from Jerusalem's destruction, and his name is called the Word of Yah. Chapter 22 and verse 18. So this is why this is so important, guys. Not only for us to understand correctly the context of Thessalonians and Peter and understanding terms like thief in the night, day of the Lord, all of his wrath, all those type of things. But this is important for a totally another reason that I'm afraid we've erred on and is really responsible for a lot of the stuff that we go through. Is at the end of the book, just a couple of chapters after this. So from here, it goes on to talk about the kingdom and then the New Jerusalem. But chapter 22, verse 18 of Revelation says, for I witness to everyone hearing the words of this prophecy of this book, which is about, from chapter 1 to chapter 18, is about the destruction of Jerusalem. And a portion of a chapter about the second coming. Just a portion. The whole book is about the destruction of Jerusalem, just like the whole of Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13 is about the destruction of Jerusalem, and a verse about the second coming of the Master. But everyone hearing the words of the prophecy of this book, if anyone adds to them, if we misinterpret this book, if we don't realize what the order is and what's actually being said and what the historical story is, if we add to these words, Elohim shall add to us the plagues that are written in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, Elohim shall take away his part from the book of life out of the set apart city which are written in this book. Wow. Guys, that's a warning. How important is it to get this timeline correct? To get the historical story correct, to understand who and what we really are? It makes all the difference in the world, because you'll never understand what the epistles are about if you don't get this timeline down, if you don't get the language down. But worse than that, because we have erred, because we do add, because we don't take it seriously, because we think it's all about us, for 2,000 years, we haven't gotten the book right, at least not from the times of the apostles. As the Gentile church became predominant, they just removed everything. And so what have we had for 2,000 years? All the plagues that are written in this book, including today, all over our planet, all the plagues written in this book have been going on because we have added to it and we have taken away from it. So it's really important that we get it right. Okay, guys, that's it for tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I did. Lots of good stuff. We're going to get more into Thessalonians next week. We got some really, really neat topics to talk about. We're going to be in Thessalonians for a while. There's 2 books to really go through. So bear with me. We'll definitely get into it. It'll be a lot of fun as we go through it. Thank you so much, everybody, for hanging out with me tonight. I really appreciate it. Guys, don't forget, this Friday is a Zoom call. We'll send out the information on Friday, and I will have details for you about our Tabernacle celebration on October 16th through the 23rd. Save those dates, get them together, plan to come. I'll have more details for you. We're going to see Tuscarora tomorrow, as a matter of fact, so we'll have information for you. And then, of course, join us on Saturday morning on Shabbat for our Hidden Manna, and, of course, for our weekend service. A jam-packed week, lots of fellowship, lots of good teaching and stuff. So we hope that you guys enjoy that. And, of course, our morning manna. We invite you there. Guys, thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight. As always, God bless and shalom.